So, okay, so let's start then. So I'll give a really very quick, short introductions of everybody, and then we'll go into directly into the speakers. Uh, we are really grateful that we have the six people who are here with us today as to speak about the issues of migration, particularly in the context of the current COVID crisis. Now, migration for the project for us from Warwick as well as JNU Theatre Research. Some of these questions on migration has been something that we were kind of really discussing at length or trying to brainstorm even before the COVID became a crisis, and a lot of work, particularly in Europe, on refugee crisis, a lot of work around those, and what might be the questions of internal migration in India or transnational migrations. These were the kind of questions that we were also kind of brainstorming a bit with. But the COVID crisis has also brought out, I guess, for a lot of us, questions that are really pressing. One is to how is this methodology on migration, larger methodologies that we have of looking at performance, how do we foreground and center migration as a category? That has been an ongoing thinking. But also with the COVID crisis, say the figure of migrant worker in the case of India, which everybody has seen with such sort of such gravity and intense sort of images that sort of came up under the conditions of crisis, which kind of brings together a lot of other questions on bordering within the country. What are borders for? And we are seeing all kinds of movements from controlling them and trying to kind of limit them into state borders or opening up in certain times, just taking them away at certain points. So we are seeing really complex questions of borders, and also as a larger concern of whether the COVID crisis and closing down of borders are also making us more, in a certain sense, more self-insulated in our methodologies. Are we kind of going there in a sense that we are actually now going more national rather than actually thinking more about transnational and cross-cultural exchanges? So the COVID, in a very complex ways, raises a lot of these questions, questions of even pedagogy, which is actually theatre pedagogy, and the place of these transnational exchanges in pedagogy and as well as theatre work and performance work. So that these are kind of really some of the questions that kind of are that we had at the start of thinking about a specific webinar on question of migration in the context of COVID. And today we are really lucky to have such a wide scholars and performers and artists from such wide uh, kind of interest and needs, and kind of who have approached questions of migration in their own works and scholarly as well as artistic work for a long time. So we have the first speaker. We have Yana Mirzun, who's the director of Studies in Migration Research Group in University of Ottawa. She's in the Department of Theatre in University of Ottawa. And her recent work, like, and I'm just quoting very recent books that she's done on migration and stereotypes in performance and culture, performance, subjectivity, cosmopolitanism, all brought out by Palgrave. And Yana is our first speaker who will raise the questions on the question of theatre and migration. Then we move into a conversation between Dr. Indu Jain and Anamika Haksar. So it's in a conversation format. That particular part is in conversation format. Indu is in faculty of University of Delhi, teaching English, but also working on theatre. That is a speciality, expert, and particularly a work on women directors in India, and very important questions on processes, etc., which is very understudied in India and kind of very emergent work. And we have read for this her article on Anamika Haksar and her works across two productions, whether it's Compositions of Water as well as Uchaka. So Indu would be in conversations with one of the most eminent directors from India, Anamika Haksar, who's, I don't need to introduce her too much. I'll just sort of very shortly say one of the really important women directors of particularly who emerged in that time period, which changed the pedagogy, very crucial interventions in theatre theater pedagogy and theater training, actor training specifically. And her very important productions include Tagore's adaptation of Tagore's Dakhar, Antaryatra, Rajdarpan, Uchchaka, compositions on water. And recently she's also moved into film work, which also we saw certain trailers of Thode Ko Jalebi, Hilane Ja Riya Hoon. So this Anamika Hafsa would be in conversation with Indu Jain. And then we have Professor Sumangala Damodaran, and she is also very widely, she's also a performer, but primarily she's professor in economics, in development studies and popular music studies in Ambedkar University. But as I said, she's also a very important archiver, documenter, and performer, singer of, and her work on IPT, Indian People Theatre Association in 1940s and 50s. Her research work has led to the book, which is called The Radical Impulse, Music in Tradition of Ipta, as well as an album, which is titled Songs of Protest, of the songs from the period. And she has collaborated with poets and musicians with South Africa in her recent works on insurrections, which has also resulted in 4 albums of music from the collaboration. Then we have Professor Ari Sitas, who's also a sociologist, is a political philosopher, a poet, and he's the head of sociology department in Cape Town, emeritus professor, chairperson of South Africa BRICS, and he's also the founding member of the Junction Avenue Theatre Company. Now, I will not go into details of his work, whether it be recent works on topical scars, voices that reason, theoretical parables, but very interestingly, today we are going to see a very few pages of his work, which is going to be published by Tulika, called A Collection of Poems. But you can see it's a very complex work on very interesting work with poetry as well as visuals, etc., called Notes on an Oratorio on Small Things That Fall, Like a Screw in the Night. So we would be one of the few people who are lucky to see this before it's released, at least in the form, in this form. And last, we have Professor Peter Marks, who's also have been a long-time collaboration with JNU in terms of coming here and teaching and engaging with our students in theater, taking them through historiography and archival work, as well as questions on very important questions on critical historiography with a hands-on mode. He is a professor and chair of theater and media studies in University of Cologne. He's also the director of Theater Wissenschaftliche Sammlung, which is one of the biggest archives in theater, very important collection on theater. And his recent works include A Cultural History of Theater in the Age of Empire, The Hamlet's Trip to Germany, A Cultural History. So these are kind of really the recent books that he sort of worked with. So we have, these are our panelists who, as you can see, are really diverse group, and hopefully we'll have, and all have worked on migration for such a long time. So now I just open and maybe invite Yana to start the presentation.
Well, thank you, Amit, for this wonderful introductions, and I'm really honored to be in this international group. So, of course, what I'm going to say, I live in Canada, so originally from Russia, but I live in Canada, so my position is a position of privilege, of course, so, and whatever I'm going to say today, I completely realize that it's going to be spoken from the position of that privilege and what we call global north, so and these remarks, so they, of course, very limited. I understand that. So I would like to also share the screen because I have some documents, some websites, to show, so I will start. I can do that, right? Yeah. Okay. Cool. So despite the fact that global migration has become our century commonplace, to paraphrase Joseph Brodsky, the Russian-American exilic poet, every time society faces a new crisis, economic, political, environmental, or related to our well-being like COVID-19, people on the move, migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants, become its litmus paper. Crisis puts those who are already vulnerable into a further state of devastation and precarity. COVID-19 is no different. As a consequence of borders being closed, migrants have become the targets of systemic discrimination once again, with certain countries, including Hungary, USA, and even Canada, suspending temporarily or otherwise their immigration programs, while the non-hygienic conditions within refugee camps and detention centers made migrants easy targets for the disease. On March 25, 2020, when the world shutdown was rapidly progressing, Errol Yogbok, a deputy director of the Project on US Leadership and Development, published an article called 5 Ways COVID-19 is Changing Global Migration, in which he spoke of the everlasting impact COVID-19 was to produce on the practices of global movement, including increasing xenophobia toward migrants and economic inequality. Due to the low skilled labor migrants usually provide, they had no option of working from home, which puts them at greater risk of contracting and spreading COVID, with almost no access to appropriate financially accessible healthcare. Despite the fact that some countries have offered migrants blanket relief measures, eased employment restrictions, and even offered access to treatment for COVID, many other places, such as Iran or Russia, refused migrants medical help or a chance of going back home, leaving people in this physical limbo. For theater practitioners and academics who are not in a position of to easily influence policymaking procedures or governmental decisions related to people's mobility, this new situation of crisis became yet another urgent reason to reevaluate our privileged position of safety and ask questions of work and research ethics, challenging both individually and as a group our methodologies of studying migration and representing it through arts. For many of us, COVID-19 created a space of imposed liminality and pause, which forced us to take a stock of our own knowledge and prejudice. It is not surprising that this crisis of global confinement unleashed many creative powers, which turned internet into new global communities. Alexander Pushkin, the great Russian poet, would have called such outcome a feast in the time of plague. Whereas Anne Bogart, an American theater director, named the surge of artistic and academic activity a collective mourning for our humanity, a mourning that often has migrants as its focal point. So here are some examples. Okay, let me do this. So this is the document I just wanted to mention. You know, this was issued on June 10. It's about the policy responses to coronavirus, you know, so if anybody is interested, and some examples. From streaming archival footage of productions related to migration, like Maxim Gorky Theater, to creating new work during the pandemic, such as The Murder of Halit Yozgat, an opera under the quarantine written by Ben Frost and streamed online during the Holland Festival in June, theater makers continued focusing the attention of global community on this unresolved issue of migration. Many academic groups, such as Migrant Dramaturgists Network from Bristol, led by Szalbos Muszka, organized discussions dedicated to the questions of migration. Siegel Talks that led with Frank Henchester of the Martin Siegel Center is in its 12th week. So, and as you see, there are, every day they have conversations. The program seeks an inclusive picture of life and art in the time of Corona, often zooming on artists of migrant background with, for example, this artist, Saman Amini, the Iranian artist from Netherlands, discussing the hardships of being a migrant in the 2020 Europe. With the recent Black Lives Matter movement, these conversations took a new turn, now focusing on the intersection of global migration and systemic racism. I was specifically drawn to this webinar to Do Black Lives Matter in Europe, organized by the Council for European Studies on June 15th, which pointed at the strong but often neglected link between history of slavery, migration, and racism. As Terry Givens, a scholar of scholar of slavery and migration in Europe, stated, when it comes to systemic racism, we must think of migration and state politics together, along the lines of historical injustice and freedom fighting. To understand the French Revolution and the significance and the shortcomings of the Declaration of the Human Rights, we need to think about it in the context of Haitian Revolution of 1791 and the American one. The history of slavery and migration are interconnected. They are not consequences of today, and they're never properly linked, either synchronically or diachronically. So my first response to the question of methodologies of researching theater and migration today is along the same lines. Just before this crisis, Palgrave invited Steve Wilmer and myself to put together a handbook on theater and migration, which would serve as a kind of survey of theater and performance practices related to the experience of global movements, both in historical and contemporary context. Conceptualizing this project during the pandemic made us focus once again on the issues of language and terminology we use around migration, new dramaturgy and performative aesthetics that might emerge because of migration, and most importantly, the urgent need to situate every concrete example of theater created by migratory subjects or about migration within its historical context. It is vital for our discipline to root our research in history, and it also to study every local event of history within the context of global movements of its own time. Methodologies of comparative literature studies, which position its subject matter within its diachronic and synchronic coordinates, seem to have disappeared from theater studies and thus need to be brought back. I'm thinking here of Edward Said, whose work we cite extensively when it comes to the questions of migration and who practiced this approach widely. Said advised to study individual texts that make a collective body of text gathered under a discursive formation, Orientalism in his case and migration in ours. Said's approach was anthropological as he examined a wide range of scholarly and artistic texts, personal accounts of traveling, political treatises, religious and philosophical studies, all of which collectively served to draw a picture of Orientalism. The unity of the large ensemble of text I analyze, Said wrote, is due to, in part, to the fact that they frequently refer to each other and hence share methodologies of representation, political and thematic concerns, and artistic technologies of constructing the discourse of Orientalism. By analogy, the plays and the theater productions we study under the umbrella of theater and migration are often deeply interconnected. They can be using images and references of displacement to capture today's history, and often the stories these works tell are deeply informed by their makers' personal histories of movement. So speaking of migration today, we need to contextualize our analysis of each chosen work within the locality of this work's making, but also at the same time within its international significance and resonance, as well as historical precedence. The same way our today crisis is both unprecedented for our own time, it is also a type of historical repetition. It is not surprising that Wajdi Mawad, the artistic director of La Colline Theatre in Paris and of Lebanon origin, chose Montesquieu's epistolary novel, Persian Letters, written in 1721 when the plague epidemic put the southern France into confinement, as his force majeure text to be reread and reperformed by the actors of his theatre during COVID-19. In Montesquieu's novel, two Persian travelers, Uzbek and Rika, write letters home from Paris to report on European society, its manners, structures of power, and religious hypocrisy. These letters are a snapshot of the society of the time, and their wisdom shines even today, states Mawad. 100 artists of La Colline Theatre read these letters day after day, making this 18th century novel of exile and confinement one of the most urgent and politically symbolic documents of our time. Today's theaters in France are reopening, and La Colline has already announced its program for the summer 2020, which will include restaging of Mawad's early tragedy, Littoral. The play looks at the society after the catastrophe, the civil war in Lebanon, and how it marked its citizens, both those who left and the exiles and their children, and those who stayed or died during the war. To Mawad, the war he experienced as a child is comparable to the global pandemic like COVID-19. And so after the war, the time of mourning and self-reflection comes. In a press release on the point of return, which accompanies the reopening of Mawad's theater this summer, the artist makes two statements. On the one hand, he salutes the end of confinement. On the other, he asks for more time to do this proper mourning. In comparing the 22 pandemic to a war, Mawad recognizes vulnerability of each of his spectators, the native Parisians and the newcomers. My second response to the question of research methodologies in theater and migration has to do with our responsibility as a theater academics to give more help in bringing migrant artists onto our stages and to our classrooms, and inviting these artists to share our academic projects and activities, which are often financially supported by government-issued grants. For example, when we think of a new project, purely academic or practices research, perhaps we could invite migrant artists to become co-applicants or beneficiaries of this work. Perhaps we could publish our findings either in academic journals or on internet together with these artists. Perhaps we could serve as liaisons between migrant theater groups and financial resources, difficult to reach for people who are still learning the language of the host. In this context, I'm fascinated by this work of the project Refugee Tales that was initiated by the Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group, the group that for 25 years has been helping refugees in the UK detention centers. Refugee Tales is a multidisciplinary project which includes 3 volumes of migration stories edited by Anna Pincus and David Herd, online performance enacted by leading UK actors, and walks in solidarity. The Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group is also a lobbying organization that provides personal support and legal help to refugees. In March 2020, the trustees of this organization have written to the Home Office and the Home Secretary calling for people in Brook House and Tinsley House and in detention in general to be released. On June 9, Refugee Tales, together with English Pen and the Society of Authors, organized an online session entitled Home, Migration and Free Movement with David Hare, Neil Makiri, and a former detainee, Ishiaba Kazunga. The conversation revolved around ideas of home, migration, free movement of people and languages alongside Pen's work with young refugee writers. This kind of work can be taken in as an example of how we can use our knowledge and expertise, as well as our privilege as academics, in bringing migrants and migrant artists to the forefront of our cultural and political lives. So to conclude this intervention, I would like to play a song. I don't know, we probably don't have time for that, but I'll just show you the site. It's a song called I Am a Refugee by Ifra Mansour, a multimedia artist and a Somali refugee in Canada, which served as a closing number of the 2020 Toronto Theatre Festival Luminata online. So I don't know, Amit, I don't have time for that, right? I can hear you. Sorry, I didn't hear. I don't need to reply to play the song.
Yeah, we can take it up in discussion if you have time.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Thank you, Anna. So now I invite Anamika Haksar and Indu for their conversation.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Yana. Thank you, Amit, for the introduction. And so I'm here to be in conversation with and also welcome amongst us Ms. Anamika Haksar, who's a veteran Indian theatre director. Amit has given you a brief introduction about her works, and I'm sure you're all much familiar with all her work. So I would just like to welcome you. Welcome, ma'am. Welcome to the group. And I would just like to say that her production, her process, her pedagogy, her interventions have become even more relevant as a reader to me today and as an academic, because when we look at the current situation of pandemic and COVID-19, especially in the Indian context, the current dispensation has failed the people of India in a very, very big way. And it's something that we see world over through the kind of images and modes of representation of the whole idea of migration, of displacement, whether it be internal displacement or at a global level. So what I see in Haksar's work is that her endeavor to bring the marginalized into the ambit of the politics of representation is something that has become extremely relevant to me and my work and my looking at her work. What also amazes me about her work is that how she brings in empathy into her work when she brings in the question of human rights. That is to say, if human rights are universal, if they are inalienable, then why can they not be realizable? This is something that I see Haksar bringing in many of her productions. And ma'am, we would like you to start with talking about some of your productions that deal with the theme of migration, like Gaon Se Sheher Tak, Uchakka, and other productions, and then probably coming to the movie, which deals with the whole idea of internal migration, especially with the inhabitants of Old Delhi. So I will not take too much time. We would definitely like you to listen to you to say.
Thank you very, very much. It's a great honor, and Indu and Vishnupriya, and to be amongst such wonderful scholars. I have to warn you, I'm not an academic. I'm a theatre person trained many, many years in theatre. So you will have to bear in the way that I will describe at a very personal level some experiences. In 1995, there were some of us who were working with a union from the outside. And we did an economic survey then in 95. Why were we interested? Because we were feeling that there was a complete breakdown of trade unions, and there seemed to be absolutely no facilities for those who were laboring in these unorganized steel sectors. These were all migrant laborers in unorganized steel sectors. And there had been two huge incidents. One is that a person had been shot because he had gone to defecate in a middle class neighborhood because there were no facilities of a toilet within that area. This became obviously a huge hue and cry, and usually people would defecate on railway tracks. The other huge incident at this time was that one of the laborers who actually protested against these very, very inhuman conditions was actually burnt in a furnace. These were two very major incidents that had happened, and though I and some friends who were working outside this union, we had actually gone and we'd said we'll do the survey and then we'll see if we can build a play, around this. So I'm saying that yes, COVID has done this huge migratory level, but the conditions, the labor conditions, the systemic breakdown of trade unions over these years, and no one actually being able to fight and even being aware. We actually in our survey even asked people that, do you know that there is minimum wage? Do you know that there are certain rights? And at that time, most of the people were not even aware of it. So what we did is we were also battling with the thing is that how to do a street play which also doesn't only sloganeer, but how does it actually reach this chord within this audience? What is the kind of visual, what are the symbols, what is the visual material that we use so that we connect directly to people, apart from, text and slogans and garnering everyone to action. So we tried to depict a sort of a visual language in which we use stock things like a roving eye for the police, a huge roving eye for the policeman, a huge kind of a note, a sort of symbolic note, for the factory worker who was minting money, the absolute stock sort of things. We also wanted to connect the thing of people's memory and longing for their village. So this child who's actually waiting for his father to return, and he longs, and then in the end, what returns is a body. It is an extreme thing because of the death of this person in the furnace, but the dead body returns, and what happens to this child, and the way he waits, and then the complete breakdown of that waiting. The other thing that we found when we had about 40 shows, and we probably reached about 40,000 people in this street play. And the other thing that we found is also that we also asked people that, what is it that you bring from your home? What is it that gives you, is there something particular? And there was some very interesting, there were a lot of people there who there was most of the labor in this particular area. Wazirpur was Bihar and UP, which is to be expected, but there was also some labor from Bengal, for example. This lady had worked as a cook in Bombay. And so we asked her that, is there something that you carry with you as a migrant? There is always, whenever you move from one place to another, whenever you're displaced, what is it that you actually carry? And she had a little cage with a small guinea pig. And I'm saying this because, we do talk about economics, but what happens? And she used to work in Bombay for some stars as a cook, and then she fell ill, she became old, and then, so I'm just trying to say that there were also these, and for her, the only thing that actually kept her and gave her company was this small guinea pig. We also found that there were people who had come, these were very few, but they actually belonged to a folk tradition. And they had been, because they could not earn anything, they had actually become rickshaw pullers, loaders in this area. We met someone who sang fantastically. I mean, this is not my area of knowledge, but he sang. He was actually a Kabir Gan person who actually was a folk, someone who sang folk music, and he had become a rickshaw puller. So for me, these small things that we discovered at that time were very, very important. We also would find that because this area had been, people had been visiting this area and working, some of the trade unions had been working with this. We found a very interesting moment in which we found there were deities on the altar, but with the deities, there was also Karl Marx also being put there. So also a sense of how were people, negotiating their sacred spaces, how were they negotiating their personal spaces, and how are they negotiating the complete breakdown of any kind of facilities, which has already happened. Now we're facing the sort of extreme version of it, but already this was something which was extremely important. There's something else that it's not really important in terms of migration as such, but in terms of the kind of material you use. So we used completely, we used scrap material because all the people were people from steel. They were basically making steel utensils, and this is an unorganized sector with absolutely no rights. I mean, we even did an exercise of showing a photograph of some of the people. And I said that, do you recognize us? It was their own photograph. And sometimes it was difficult. Of course, this is not the day, this is 95. So mobile, both these things are not there. But recognizing yourself as an entity, as your own identity, as a person, and not being able to even recognize that in your own photograph, it's very interesting. So these were things which were quite revealing for me. The other thing, which was a different thing, was that we also asked that what does it mean to you to come to the city, so that we don't presume things about someone coming to the city. What does it really mean? So there were two replies which I found very interesting. One was a very young, upbeat boy, very young, 21, 22. He said, I belong to a particular caste. Now, I don't actually remember the caste now. But for me, when I went into the industry where I was working, this is the first time that I actually, this is a very rare case because there's a huge amount of caste even in this area and in their work. But he was someone who said that no one asked me my caste, and I was working along with upper caste people. So that was something which was very interesting, but that's an exception. I don't think that's a rule. And the other thing is, someone said that, we don't have money to go on holidays, as in some days, we don't really have the money. So we walk 15 kilometers to see historic sites in Delhi. That thing of curiosity, that thing of connecting to history, to, the history of the city, to walk 15 kilometers with no money in your pocket. You're actually going there and you're connecting to Qutub Minar, to Red Fort. And another thing which was very interesting, that we kept a small library on a cart, on a thela. what was this library? This at that time, if you remember, there was the People's Publishing House, which was the Soviet publishing house. There were things like Mother. There were things like How the Steel Was Tempered. There were a lot of Russian literature for children in Hindi. Now, what was very, very interesting, which I found again very moving, is people actually, these were all 18, 19, 20-year-olds. Many of them were educated from till the 10th, 9th, 10th. They loved these books. There was such a curiosity and such a deprivation of knowledge and books that actually our cart, after 1 month, the books got stolen. And I thought that was a huge victory. As in, you're actually taking away, you're actually stealing something. And I don't call it stealing. I just call it that you don't have the facility for a book. The huge curiosity, the huge need to be educated, the huge lack of pessimism and cynicism that I saw in this area, despite all this, was something which gave me a lot of strength. The second work which we did, which was Uchakka, which is another kind of migration, because you may have read and maybe seen a few photographs of, but these are people who were branded and by the British Empire as criminal tribes. Their entire, their artisanship, their weaving, everything broke down. They were called the criminal tribes, and since they had no resources, they were really out on the streets. So there were two things happening. You are migrating from the area of your work, and you are now absolutely without anything. You are pickpocketing and you're thieving. And this is the first generation autobiography by a person called Lakshman Gaikwad. And they are absolutely no facilities. And also you are from a caste which is a criminal tribe. So you actually are the other in all senses of the word. You are a migrant, you have migrated from Andhra Pradesh, you come into the streets of Maharashtra and you exist as pickpockets and beggars. And this is something which I thought was very important, because as Lakshman Gaikwad, who became actually a very dear friend and guided us as to how we should approach the work, he said his father was actually the only person who said, I'm giving you a pen and I don't want you to go back to pickpocketing, because there was police brutality, there was violence as an everyday thing. They used to beat up themselves so that they could be prepared and temper themselves so that when the police beat up, they were actually strong enough. And this happens even today, though there are a lot of work has been happening. There's been some social reform. So you belong in many ways, as by your caste, you don't belong anywhere. And by the fact that all your livelihood has been broken and smashed again, you do not belong. So you are in a sense that you absolutely, your identity has been broken into splinters. And so in Uchakka, the whole thing was that how to bring about this complete violence that people have faced. The violence of daily living, the violence of police brutality, the violence of sexual violation, which was happening on a regular basis. Rape was used as political violence. What is that body? How do you prepare that body? And this is a middle class, maybe actor. And how do we actually, bring him or her to understand? There's a very interesting polemical thing there, in which there is the Brahmin women who are going there to defecate. And in the same place, the community, the Paradhi community, people from there are eating pork. So the Brahmins are turning up their nose, this is a smell, and my God, what are they doing? But they are defecating in the place where this community is eating. So how do you actually represent something like this in theater? And we actually used, white hips from which, people were just defecating in the same area where people were actually eating. And this is the sort of polemics this whole book, this whole autobiography has. What is that condition? And it was very interesting because this whole play, which was received in one way, in the urban areas that we performed, became a completely different reception when we reached Nanded, where this particular book was actually part of their curriculum. And people cracked up, and this was mainly the Dalit community who was the spectators. People just cracked up. I was like, has this become a comedy? So I said, what is so funny? He said, no, because we're actually facing this. This is part of our daily living. So this is when you see this actually happening, when you see the gutter being clogged, when you see the water being divided, when you see the space, there's a sort of gutter which releases blood every 15 minutes. And you see this, and there's something strange. It's so painful that it's actually funny. It became like that. This was the condition which we faced. I mean, one can talk at length, about Uchakka. And I mean, if there's something you specifically want me to talk about, I can, because it's a whole process. And, but I think what was important was this whole space of being the other in more ways than one. And the other thing is, for example, a very polemical scene is then they go to the place where, the Vitthaba is worshipped. The temple is worshipped. They go to the Pandharpur. It is a very religious place. Everyone is in their religious ecstasy. And they go and they have their own code line. They are actually stealing and pickpocketing in those areas. Again, a whole conflict of the conditions of life. And so that is also something which a lot of people who are from this community are forced to do. And we found a resonance of this when we actually went to do a huge survey in Ghode Ko Jalebi Khilane Le Ja Rahi Hoon. Ghode Ko Jalebi is a film in which we studied for 3 years. We had a questionnaire and we actually went to pickpockets. We went to people working in small scale industries. We went to beggars, we went to domestic workers, we went to people from the unorganized sectors, people who were laboring, mainly from Bihar, UP. Suddenly we found a lot of Kashmiri Muslims also coming down, which they never did come down. They are also coming down to labor here. We suddenly find people from Bengal coming to labor here. We suddenly find that people have come from the famine of Maharashtra. And we suddenly find a whole lot of people from Vidarbha speaking in Marathi, and they're there at this particular area, Hanuman Mandir in Delhi. So where all and what all has compelled people to leave their cities, to come to these areas, and how are they actually surviving, was something which was absolutely,
Ma'am, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So this movie, which English translates as Taking the Horse to Eat Jalebis. Jalebi is an Indian sweet. And I am one of the lucky ones who got to see this movie in Bombay. So I feel very happy about that. Now, ma'am, I wanted to ask this question. Now, this movie delineates the lives, dreams, aspirations, and fears of the migrant inhabitants of Old Delhi. And yes. I was very fascinated by the first scene. So I would just briefly inform everybody. In the first frame, there is an animated goddess Lakshmi who's throwing marigold flowers over the dreamer's face. However, a giant red communist flag being held by another laborer in his dream, it kind of recreates the image of the Russian Revolution, pokes her and enters the first person's dream. So whole the narrative, timeline, sound, dialogues, even the dreams are not linear and singular and often clash with each other, creating a multi-dimensional visual for the audience. So how did you work around these kind of images in this movie, which is full of these images? And what was this image of the two dreams clashing with each other?
First of all, I'd like to say that we actually kept in our interviews, we kept very strictly to the fact that we are only and we never recorded audio. We just wrote what people said to us. So I would say most of the images have actually come from the people, from the migrant laborers and domestic workers of that area, of Old Delhi. And so when we say there is this man who is Chadammi, he is a sweet vendor, And he actually, all the time, he's a bhakt. And bhakt means someone, he's a believer. So he all the time dreams of, devis, of gods and goddesses. And with him on the roof comes a migrant laborer who was meant to go to Dubai. This is a real story. And he was forged. There was a forgery and he was left high and dry in the city. And he doesn't manage to go to Dubai. He's from Kerala and he's stranded on this roof. So and then there is a pickpocket who's stranded. So the guy from Kerala is actually someone who dreams of the revolution. He actually does. He actually dreams of, changing things. This other vendor is all the time dreaming of gods and goddesses, and he has a sort of very personal relationship with all these gods and goddesses. And the pickpocket is sort of, he's a believer, but we don't know his ideology. But he, in this film, there's a point in which he finds this book which has the Lal Salam in it, and he gives it, he pickpockets it and gives it actually to, to this man, because he knows that's his conviction. So there's also a sense of very different convictions living together, which is something we actually found when we were working among this community. And some of the very vital dreams, which will also relate to today, is that there is a constant dream. 3 times I got these dreams in which people are saying that we are dreaming that we have plentiful. We have, we have rice, we have lentils, we have wheat, and we dream that we are giving them to people. And as we are giving, the people disappear. So the sense of a person who is a migrant laborer who does not have enough is constantly dreaming of bounty and of plentiful, and dreaming that he also can be in a position to give, which is also a very upper class thing. We like giving, we are all very good with, look, I gave so many packets for the migrant workers. But, the migrant worker would also be liking to be in a position to give. And the constant dreams of not being able to give. And so this was something. The other thing which we found among the community, now these are people who are 30 and below. If in 95, there were still people who remember their stories, their folk stories, they would, if they were Hindu, many of them would remember Ramayana and Mahabharata. Today, that memory is erased. 30 downwards. Of course, I am not an authority. I am not an academic. This is only from 70 interviews. But memories of their stories, of their village, of folk stories have gradually been erased, perhaps maybe kept through music, perhaps maybe, through some anecdotes, but they have reduced from the times that 20 years ago when we actually were working in this area. The other thing that was all constant, we had some very interesting dreams in which there is a vegetable vendor who says that each time she sells these vegetables, something happens to her. In the faces of the vegetables, she starts seeing the dead bodies of her children, and they have turned to ashes. Why I'm saying this is that today we're talking about, what is happening today is huge, but it is already there. The fear underlying the labor areas of Delhi is phenomenal and undescribable. What is this? The person looks calm, selling vegetables. Look at the kind of dreams of dead bodies, dreams of stench, dreams of a temple which is going on a riverbed which has dried up. The pickpocket constantly dreaming of being pursued. He's being pursued all the time. This thing of running away, running. You're on the run. You're on the run. You're on the run, which is happening today. You're on the run. So in a way, I felt that in this film, in many ways, we sort of preceded something that which is now happening on a scale which is absolutely brutal and unforgivable, actually. At the same time, I just 1 second. Apart from the film, before I forget, I want to say that the film is dealing mainly with UP, Bihar, and Old Delhi, but there is a huge gamut of migrant workers from Northeast who are coming in restaurants, who are coming in salons and in spas, and that hope that they had left all their villages in Northeast, they're coming here to live a life of dignity, that the terrible humiliation with which they are returning today, in which, how to face that family, in which they were meant to be the providers, they were meant to be bringing things. That whole breakdown, of expectations, that whole mental, psychological humiliation of people trying to face this, whether you're from the Northeast or so many, how do you face people who you are actually meant to support and you're going back and living on them? The psychological trauma of people like this. Sorry, Andrew, what were you saying?
Yes, ma'am, I thought to conclude, if you could just little bit talk about, this is in context with Yana's thing, that if we can include these migrant artists, etc. in our production. I think in this movie, apart from the 4 lead actors, you have actually worked with these very people, so
yes,
if you could just talk a little bit about your process, that how.
Yeah. And even in the street play that we did, we began with 2 NSD actors, but the street play was given over to workers. And there were 5 workers who did the Gaon Se Sheher Tak. And here also there are 350 people from the streets who are the actors, apart from the main 4 actors who are trained actors. None of them knew anything about acting. Most of them were illiterate. So we went from night shelter to night shelter, talking to each person so that they could actually start learning their text and how to get that text. Also, it's very interesting because from our research, we are actually researching from people, but many of the people have moved out. So then we are giving it to another section of people, and they are playing the part of these people, but they still remain street people. So a lot of sorry, Indu, am I going off a bit?
No, absolutely.
So we are then, talking and training people from night shelters, from street places, from people who live on rooftops. So this is like an ongoing process, which is then used into this film.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And I'm sure everybody has a lot of questions, which we can take up later in the discussion. Amit?
Yeah, thank you so much. Now I ask Sumangala Damodar.
Yeah, thank you, Amit. I'm not very sure what I'm going to say because I didn't. I mean, I'm not a theatre person per se. I'm a singer and a researcher and an academic. So what I'm going to say. I'll just try and sort of talk about some major trends that have been observed over the years as far as migration in India is concerned, and how does that relate in some sense? Just a couple of pointers maybe to do with say musical practice, and what could be ways in which what social scientists do in migration studies. Could have a conversation perhaps with theatre persons. I mean, it's Anamika has talked at length about how both these have come together in her work, but I'll just sort of try and focus on the present a little bit. So if we actually look at what happened in India, and India of course was in that sense on the global stage, so to say, with the big migration crisis. And the visual image of lakhs and lakhs of people walking home from the places that they were working in. So all kinds of terrible fears were ignited as a result. So this whole idea of the migrant being the deviant, which has played out in different ways in different parts of the world, in India seem to have acquired, uh, um, a huge significance. So to begin with, there was this complete um, disbelief as far as the newspapers were concerned, about how these migrants could be so stupid. And don't they understand how difficult life can be if they do this? And so this whole idea that migrants are not obeying social distancing norms, and how in an otherwise controllable situation, which the government was also trying to propagate, that India was actually managing the COVID crisis very well. These hundreds of thousands of migrant workers walking home in the most perilous and difficult of circumstances seem to be embarrassing the government. So the initial reactions were really about the ugliest face of large groups of migrant workers being sprayed with sanitizers and disinfectants and all kinds of things at the borders, and those really horrifying images on all fronts. On the other hand, of course, there was that real big symbol of defiance, which is the right to leave for home and the symbol of the home, and which really made it obvious that it was people who were not the poor migrants, or the ones who remained in the cities, or the ones who were better placed class-wise or caste-wise for that matter, who were the root of the problem. So there was also this buzz that went around among primarily the poor, and also among a large number of these migrants who were fleeing, that this great the refuge of the cities are really the cause of the COVID crisis. It's you people who are bringing the disease from abroad, those who travel overseas and so on. So we are running away from you. So it was a peculiar kind of a narrative that was playing out at that time, and it actually generated a whole series of images, I think, which in some sense brought social science and the possibilities of social science work and artistic practice coming together, because of the kind of multiplicity of images that came up. So, if I could just very quickly go over some of the things that social scientists have been talking about India for at least at least 2 or 3 decades now, which is about the agrarian crisis and about what is happening in the countryside and how people are being driven away from the countryside, where the middle classes were not taking it seriously beyond a point. This almost seemed to be posing the question that yes, India has been through a serious agrarian crisis, and people were pushed out from the countrysides into other parts of the country. But then, what does this say really? This kind of reverse movement back into back to their homes. The second set of questions that really were thrown up were about categories of migration. So there was, and there's been any amount of work on, who the different categories of migrants are. So, Jan Bremen's famous term footloose labor, about the seasonal migrant, so the whole idea of seasonal migration, circulatory migration, the distinction between long-term migration, short-term migration. Again, all of this seemed to have been thrown up in the air. Who were these people who were going back? Were they the long-term migrants? Yes, many of them were actually those who would consider themselves long-term migrants, but who were saying that, we don't trust your cities anymore, or we don't trust our places of work anymore, we want to go back home. So again, social scientists who believed that home was not really a destination for these long-term workers are having to rethink the idea of migration, about long-term migration itself. The third category really, which has been, again, researched a lot in India, is that of the informal sector. So the relationship between between processes of migration and informalization. And if anything is true about what has happened to work and livelihoods in India, it is about you know, informalization across the board. And it is when people who, you know, sort of white collar workers sitting at home who've suddenly found that they don't have a job anymore, or that working from home is actually about informalization, that this reality of what informalization has meant has come home. So in a certain sense, this crisis that has unfolded, which is not new, but which is perhaps just been magnified as a result of COVID-19, is bringing into very, very sharp relief what social scientists have been talking about to a large extent over the past 2 or 3 decades, about the relationship between migration and different aspects of Indian society. If we have to think as art practitioners, what are the ways of representing this? Of course, we've also had a very long history in India and in South Asia, and of course in different parts of the world, of representing this, of trying to deal with these kinds of issues. Of course, I mean, from my own, comfort zone, I can think of songs. And, what is happening is that a lot of the material that is getting thrown up is in the form of musical traditions. One of the most obvious musical traditions that comes to mind for those from North India is the Bidesiya. And for the theatre people making theatre in North India, the Bidesiya is a very well-known form, but the Bidesiya, of course, is a form, which is talking about the Bidesiya, which is the one who has gone to a foreign land. Now, so what is this foreign land? And it is said that the Bidesiya as a form originated in Bihar sometime in the 18th century, as a response to a lot of the migration that was happening from Bihar to other parts of the country as well as to other parts of the world, and primarily indentured labor. So there has been very interesting work on the Bidesiya and similar kinds of forms, and there are any number of different traditional forms which talk about migration. What Tejaswini Niranjana's work on the songs of what she calls Jahaji Bhai, that is the how does one translate Jahaji Bhai? Brotherhood of ships, or brothers on ships, to talk about the music of people who migrated to the Caribbean as indentured labor. Tries to bring together a whole series of traditions with all kinds of metaphors that depict different aspects of migration. I mean, crossing the ship, of course, being representing the most distant of migrations, but then there are any number of these kinds of metaphors that one finds from any number of musical traditions in different parts of the country. Not just metaphors that come from songs. I have a PhD student who is working on dying in the city of Delhi. She's looking at the right to the city and looking at who belongs and who doesn't belong, in death. So she has actually been doing fieldwork in Wazirpur. In fact, Anamika, the same place that you did work many years ago, in Wazirpur, and she came across a migrant worker who came up with this, who said, "Dilli ka jeena acha hai, lekin marna bura hai," which translated means that it's living in Delhi is good, but dying in Delhi is terrible. So this particular worker doesn't want to die in Delhi, wants to die and be taken away to the village. So in fact, that statement, I think, is really illustrative of the kind of sentiments that the migrant workers who were fleeing and going away home were actually expressing. So despite the worst of conditions perhaps awaiting them when they got back home, they still preferred to go back home, um, you know, belying a lot of the expectations that economists had, for example, that migration actually meant forgetting about home and wanting to leave the village behind. So this um, so songs and these kinds of metaphors which come up from field work, I think could be a very um, productive set of tools that one could employ in different ways in artistic practice. The other thing, of course, is objects. Now, Jan Bremen, um, about 10 years ago, along with the Association of Indian Labour Historians, got together with the historian Professor Sabyasachi Bhattacharya and published a book of photographs, that they had taken of the objects in the homes of migrant workers. And these are workers that Jan Bremen had kept in touch with over 50 years of field work in Gujarat. So just on the objects, that what are the changes that have occurred inside people's homes, in terms of the objects that are available. Again, for theatre makers, I'm sure objects are a fascinating, device to work with. Ari Sitas and I have been in conversation about some of these things for over 10 years now, and I have um, um, I have found Ari's work on parables very useful, and what Ari, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you call the private theaters of the mind, about in the midst of extremely difficult conditions on the shop floor, what is it that allows a migrant worker humanity? What are the metaphors and what are the kinds of symbols that people carry, not just from their own lives and not just from immediate lives, of their immediate forefathers, but perhaps from 2 centuries ago. How are these memories carried through in the form of parables, in the form of songs, in the form of sayings that allow people to remain sane. And again, so that I think would, I have found that very useful in sort of bringing these two aspects of artistic practice and social science together. Yeah, I think I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, now we move to Ari, and he has just introduced a concept from me. So let me try and do a screen sharing of the book that we are saying that it is going to be published. So we have the opportunity to see it a bit. So let me just do that screen sharing and then Ari. Is this visible? Is this visible? Is this clear? Yeah. Yeah. So this is the one. And Ari, I'll just tell me if I need to stop at some point. So this is the title. And this is going to be published by, so it's in publication. It should come out at any moment from Tulika Books. So this is, so I just show you the contents to kind of just to get a sense of it, and then we'll quickly move into the first few pages.
it's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, Adi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the book was supposed to have been out, and there's two ways that it connects to what we are. Sorry, I'm just hearing a lot of static. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. It's not printed. It's not out because all the migrants have left Delhi, and the printing shops are not working at the moment. But Tulika Press has not brought it out yet. The second connection with what is being discussed is that Anuradha Kapoor, in the previous seminar, was speaking about dark things. And dark things, this is the mothership from which dark things emerged. And it is basically a reconstruction of an attempt at a reconstruction, both poetic, theatrical, sociological, of the underside of the Silk Roads we're talking about, the underside of all these hazmat highways that are defining the world that we know all about. It was a desperate attempt because we're exposed to the fact that 60 million people were in tents. And the same material that makes the hazmat suits makes the tents. And if you enrich the fabric, it becomes the boats that we see sinking or making it to the other side in all the seas migrants and refugees are using at the moment. So this became increasingly obvious as a major challenge all over the world. Think of it. You've got 60 million people in tents. You had, you could fill in Vietnam with this kind of population. So since the 1970s, I've been active in labor movement, in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, in the theater movement, working with migrants, working in the steelworks, working with migrant steel workers, creating plays with them, and being part of what became the workers' theater movement in South Africa, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, where plays like the Dunlop play, the Samkol play, all these plays became very axiomatic in terms of the liberation of literature of the time. So, but migration in South Africa was a different creature altogether, was part of the system of the very exploitation of the Black majority, that people had to be deemed to be migrants, live in the rural areas, only by permission working in the so-called white areas and housed in hostels, in compounds, in prison-like conditions, in single-sex areas, and so on. So a lot of the townships that you see emerging are happening by exemption, not by rule during that time. So everybody was deemed to be a kind of migrant. Everybody had to have a rural home somehow. And the thought by the apartheid regime of splitting urban from migrants was high on the apartheid story. And precisely the labor movement is the one that broke that problem's back. It organized everybody in trade unions, and the trade unions became social movement unions. And I was privileged to be part of that kind of ferment and observe things. I've always been an exile from theater studies. And also increasingly from the 1990s, an exile from theater practice itself, was much more involved with poetry, with music, and with other genres. But I'm returning slowly now that there is more time, because as we know, good theater work takes time and energy. And if you have to, balance the books at the end of the month, sometimes you choose other things than theater work. So, but that kind of migration gave me a lot of the insights and the theoretical parables, and a lot of the ideas around theorizing itself came from those type of encounters, because daydreams were important, as Sumangal said, and also as you were saying, Anamika, you know, that space through which, despite the system, there is an attempt to cohere a life, an aspiration, a feeling, and so on, that's irreducible to the powers around you. So anyway, but that's the South African story. And now the urban-rural interconnections continue, but now we have different kind of dilemmas. Since the 1980s and 90s, with the structural adjustment programs on the African continent, and with wars that happen, a new African diaspora is afoot, which means a depeasantization, but not a deruralization. The home remains, but people are on the move. Vast numbers are on the move everywhere, creating new communities wherever they can. And of course, South Africa is one of the spaces through which these communities get recreated. And we had xenophobic attacks here in 2008, repeated in 2015, and yet at the same time, politically, we're saying the borders have to go, whereas de facto violence is spreading at the grassroots in peculiar ways. And you know, I would say that in South Africa at the moment, more than 10% of the population is not South African from the rest of the continent, and it's much higher than many of the European statistics. And let's not go to Lebanon or Jordan or other places where a lot of the absorption of refugees and migrants is happening at this stage. But what I find peculiar and following the networks, these migrants, is the fact that in Europe at the moment, there's new sociological concepts emerging. You know, social insecurity has become a major concept, fundamental concept. Phenotypes are returning. Major research projects about identifying people by the way they look, the way they walk, and so on, as some kind of problem. The darker strangers in the neighborhood has become one of the big moral panics. And we all know what the consequences are. The new right, the new grassroots movements. You know, Europe was supposed to be about Gesellschaft. It's become about Gemeinschaft as well. So there are all kinds of peculiar new dynamics around migration that are very, very recent. The aid to Africa at the moment of the European Union translates into you won't get a cent unless you have programs to keep your people home. So it's a new conditionality that's beginning to emerge in the negotiations. So migrants are some kind of problem. You know, so at them once again. And now this pandemic has really created both a trappedness amongst migrants, but also an attempt to return home. Now, lucky are the ones who have been allowed to return home on the African continent, because there's still the home in the countryside. But those who are trapped are in peculiar new forms of situation at this stage in time. Not the formal ones. We know about the Lampedusas. We know about the way migrants are being encamped, and you know, the Greek islands, and in new ways. And there is a new incarceration, and new feelings, new kind of poetry that's emerging there, new type of experiences. But we're talking about those who are trapped in between there and nowhere. So those voices are very, very important. Now, I want to say another two little things and just rest my case. For the African continent, the borders were a construction of the late 19th century, when Berlin became the host of this imperial power conference that drew the lines that divided Africa between the various colonizing powers. So, you know, so the border, what creates the outside, has always been vulnerable and very much in question. But at the same time, all attempts to break them down politically have failed. So we are in that dilemma. The second dimension is that during the South African experience of the creative outburst that came out of the anti-apartheid struggle, the struggles of migrant workers, the trade unions, COSATU, and others, you know, in a revival of wonderful oral forms was afoot. And once that started, finding a new platform in the labor movement, in the community venues, people started realizing, but they could do stuff like that. So the performative was back. Oral poetry all of a sudden got rediscovered, but with new content, you know, creating tensions with the old forms about it. And neologisms and new metaphors started proliferating. New ways of performing, because it was outside a lot of the formal theaters. Already that started with the Black consciousness movement, avoiding dominant theaters. But now, all of a sudden, every space became a performative space. And under apartheid, the streets were not as available as they were in India for performance. Immediately, that would call the police and the riot squad. So, but any possible venue was being utilized by collective ensembles to produce their stories in very interesting ways. And a lot has been written about that. So, you know, this ability to traverse the countryside, its traditions, and sustain it in the cities, and find new ways through which to speak about urban shocks and about the challenges, has left a very serious imprint on what is now becoming theater in the country. So I would like to stop there and say I'm delighted to be in such company, and you know, struggling in and through stories, forms, and commitments is the future, and that was the past too. Alas, the bad guys are still winning.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ali. Now we move to Peter.
Thank you so much. I tried to share my screen with you. I hope this works, and I hope you can see sort of some of my slides. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for having me. There's a certain extent to which the following remarks might be in danger of sounding trivial vis-a-vis all the sort of contemporary accounts we've heard, but I tried to develop a historical or historiographic perspective as Jana had sort of called for it in her statement, because I think it's also important to understand what is the cultural logic, the way we think and the way we talk about it. And in contrast to the dream images Anamika has spoken about, I rather speak about collective images and their instrumentalization by media and politicians. When the COVID-19 situation sort of became obvious and public and created the political measures it has throughout Europe, it was remarkable that there seemed to be something like a horror vacui vis-a-vis this historical situation. Lacking precedents that would allow for understanding the situations, politicians, journalists, intellectuals seem to seek for new and different forms to respond to this. And one of my arguments is that in the Western discourse about the pandemic, we see a palimpsestic structure. We see historical echo chambers that are used sometimes deliberately, sometimes they might not be used as deliberately, but they are still as effective. And this is what I'm interested in, the question of images, scenarios, and the consequences they imply and they call for. Taking this horror vacui, this threat of an empty visual space that needs to be filled, because this emptiness is too threatening. Vis-a-vis this threat, it is interesting that two main sources were referenced, especially in the cultural discourse. The one was the medieval discourse, the medieval images of the plagues. I here have brought you The Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Albrecht Dürer. And the other one, and here I spared you the images, are these ubiquitous images of US American catastrophic movies that for decades have indulged in the idea of a dreadful pandemic, and sort of that had fed us with images of the catastrophe long before. With respect to the question of migration and the pandemic crisis, I think it's interesting that the official rhetoric very quickly sort of turned to a logic of containment. A logic of containment that started to fuel the political rhetoric. Can you still see my presentation, or have we lost it?
No, you can see.
Okay. And especially it is interesting sort of how this resonated with the specific kind of rhetoric Donald Trump has engaged in over the past years already. His continuous reference of the idea of a wall clearly has a very strong pop culture reference with the mega popular series Game of Thrones, where the wall is an ice border separating the living dead from the living. The images of the plague that were equally ubiquitous called for containment, fostered ideas of purity, and this was connected with the very military rhetoric of calling for the battle against an invisible enemy. Trump's more recent rhetoric of calling the coronavirus the Kung Fu virus, something he sort of really pushes forward, uses resonance spaces of an old topic of the yellow peril discourse from the late 19th century. And here I brought you a German image from 1895, which was instrumentalized by the German Kaiser in the war against the Chinese. Another point of reference here, of course, in the long-term perspective, is the medieval remembrance of what is called the Mongol threat, particularly the presence of Genghis Khan in the European mind. All these images sort of contribute to a series of mental oppositions or conceptual oppositions that fuel our historiographic approach. It's the opposition of longevity and stability versus the nomadic or the migratory, of purity and health versus impurity and disease, homogeneity versus contagion. What makes these oppositions so powerful and so dangerous at the same time is that they have become almost invisible in our political discourse. They are considered to be self-evident. concepts. Boaventura de Sousa Santos, by contrast, has defined the Western thinking as abyssal thinking, and he characterizes it in two, I guess, interesting ways. He writes, I quote, "What most fundamentally characterizes abyssal thinking is the impossibility of co-presence of the two sides of the line." The idea of two sides of the line sort of speaks to the question of border crossing, of migration, and the co-presence and the idea of multiplicity. De Sousa Santos continues, I quote, "On the other side of the line, there is no real knowledge. There are beliefs, opinions, intuitions, and subjective understandings, which at the most may become objects or raw materials for scientific inquiry. The other side of the line comprises a vast set of discarded experiences, made invisible both as agencies and agents, with no fixed territorial location." With respect to theater history, European theater history to be more precise, it is interesting that from the Middle Ages onwards, theater history is aligned with the question of being nomadic, migratory, or to settle down. In most textbooks of theater history, a stone building of theater is still considered to be a milestone in the development of a theatrical landscape. But if we take De Sousa Santos serious, we might also ask for what is on the other side of the line? What kind of knowledge, belief, opinion, intuition could be found there? And how would this relate to the experience of a pandemic crisis? I have brought you, and with this I will conclude my brief remarks. I've brought you two further pictures which might give us a hint of what is found on the other side of this line that's established in the European thinking firmly in the 18th century. On the left, you see one of Tiepolo's images of Pulcinella, one of the Italian masks of the Commedia dell'arte. Whereas on the right, you see a remarkable frontispiece from Viennese print from the 18th century. While we see the allegory of foolishness in the foreground of the picture, in the back you see the grave of Hanswurst, the comic character of the German comedy, only to be saved or resurrected as Harlequino. The idea of a resilience rooting in the other line of the theatrical practice, not the legitimate drama, but the physical action, might be an impetus to think more about figures and images of resilience, resurrection, and resistance, rather than images of separation and the battle against the invisible enemy. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Peter. So we had such a wonderful panel, and I'll just, with a quick remark, I'll just open it for discussions now and questions. That, all the presentations in a certain way did the questions that we started with, whether it be the boundaries or changing logics of boundaries and boundedness, a longing for home or the distances between home or going back, which became quite interestingly presented here in all the discussions, and also dreaming and certain things that say the artistic practices sort of give extra to what does it mean to live as the category of life itself, as dreaming, longing, and kind of affective belonging, whether it's to home or it is to the place where you are and what you carry. Certain things that it comes is that it's possibly for me also it kind of has been a question, and which was addressed here is that it's the COVID kind of accentuates some of these problems, some of these ways of structuring our thinking, our lives, but also the kind of centrality of long-term, historical forces in the processes of longing and dreaming, which allow certain kind of violent imageries as well as certain hopes of living and certain places of living, even under conditions of such extreme conditions of distress. So I thought those are very interesting, and for theatre histories or performance histories, that these sort of long-term processes, structures, ways in which people imagine or are conditioned by normative is actually quite fascinating and really makes us think again and again about ways of what is it to make us live and what is to understand migration. So I just sort of picked up something, and I'm just opening it up for discussions, and I'm sure there are lots of questions that are already there. So even people can just, I think, ask questions, start, or if somebody is speaking and they want to ask a question, just put it in the chat, and I'll also start collating them also. So.
And there's not a question. Can I just, there was just one lot of statistics which I wanted to, can I just read that out? Or is that now not on? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Please do. Yeah.
I just wanted to say the COVID, I had just got these statistics from someone who's researched. 114 million job losses, 91 million daily wage workers, 17 million salary workers have been laid off across 271,000 factories. 65 to 70 million small and micro enterprises have been halted. I wanted to say that in my last bit, just to give the figures of what has actually happened during this particular 3 months. That's all. Just say.
And Anamika ma'am, there is a question for you actually in the chat box. And Trina has asked that if you could say a little about the source of the title of the film, and does it have something specific to do with Old Delhi?
Yeah, it does. This is an aunt who used to learn music in Old Delhi. And she went, this is many years ago, this is about 30 years, 35 years ago, she told me this anecdote. She went to catch a tanga. Because in those days, there were these horse carts, tanga. And he said, should I say it in English or Hindi? I don't know. I mean, actually, it's a Hindi thing. I mean, he says, I don't have time because I have to feed jalebis to the horses. So that was what he said. It's a very colloquial thing. I mean, in Hindi, "Are bibi, mere paas waqt nahi hai, ghode ko jalebi khilane le ja raha hu." So, as in, this ghode ko jalebi are two completely opposite things. So the ghoda may be very emaciated and not being able to eat his basic chana, but he is being. This is up to a person. It's actually a very colloquial Old Delhi humor, which is why I kept this title, because I felt it was echoing everywhere in the film.
Sylvia had a question.
Thank you everyone for this really fascinating panel. I had, there is so much to think about. And as I wrote, I mean, I thought I think of a question that I could type neatly, but somehow I cannot, because I think it's more of a comment and the question. I find it fascinating how some things that people were talking about connect as well, and on various levels, and for me, listening to some of it was like, because we spoke about images, Peter spoke about collective images, but also looking at them synchronically and diachronically, as Diana was saying. And Anamika was talking about individual images that were fascinating, but they were also collective in some sense, because it's the migrant labor workers representing themselves and others, I suppose, if I can say so. So, and for me, this looking through these images sort of made me see certain things anew. Also, for example, Sumagala's comment about home and the migrant and the relationship to home, migrant workers in the relationship to home, and actually, when I was watching these processions of images, I was thinking, oh, these people are forced to leave in some ways, and in some ways they are forced to leave. But then this point, like it's good to live in Delhi, but it's terrible to die in Delhi. Sort of put a completely different twist to it for me. So I feel that I've sort of seen or heard things that I knew about in a somewhat new way today, you know, from a new angle, from a deeper angle. And I think, I mean, everyone seems to also grapple with how do we engage with these topics in solidarity? How do we engage in these topics so that we, how do we represent as academics or as artists or as both? You know, and what are the ethical ways? What are the right ways? And I suppose my question is somewhere around that. And I found really very interesting how different modes came out. There were dreams and image through dreams rather than the linear narratives, for example, or through music and song rather than sort of some kind of documentary mode of storytelling, or through walks and movements. And Ari was talking about space and collective space of assembling and doing work. So on the one hand, I'm sort of, I would like to repose this question of solidarity and how do we sort of work with these topics, and also with people who embody these topics in a way, in solidarity, and in ways that are ethical, in what are the forms. I mean, it's a big question, I know. And then on the other hand, and I don't know how, but it's this linkage that was also addressed between arts and political reality, because trade unions have been mentioned on many occasions, and the sort of in South African context, in Indian context, I think even when we think here in the UK, for example, it's important. So this disintegration or weakening of trade unions, weakening of systemic structures that are potentially protective, you know, and then the impact of that, and maybe is there a relationship between political art and academic activism and this sort of more direct political action? I don't know if it makes any sense, but anyway, that's now for all the speakers, so whichever order you like to take it.
I would like to actually pick up on this, you know, because specifically from Canadian context, you know, so which is little different to European and American and so on. So there are, first of all, you know, it was interesting when Anamika was talking about the actor's work, right? And I was thinking, you know, so like you were talking about the whole question, how do you sort of, you know, bring, you know, the actor who is not familiar with the migrant realities, you know, to play those realities. And in Canadian context, theater context, and especially in the English side, you know, so this kind of tension between, you know, so how do we represent, you know, the truth of suffering, you know, so it's been for a long time, you know, so that pushed a lot of discussion, a lot of conversation about the need, you know, the immediate need to bring people with that particular experience on stage, because that kind of authenticity gives us better, you know, empathy and so on. So there's that kind of a very long, you know, discussion, and very unresolved discussion, I think, you know, so that's one thing. And the other one, you know, like what Sylvia was talking about just a second ago about the home and longing, you know, so when I was writing these remarks, you know, so I actually was thinking more about people who have kind of integrated, you know, into the society, you know, so they probably started in as political refugees or as migrant workers or something, but they for years, you know, have been contributing to the new society. And with the COVID, you know, so they were kind of, you know, thrown back to the 0 point, you know, of their own arrival, you know. So it's kind of a home. What is home in this situation, right? You know, so the home which was maybe 30 years ago left, you know, and so what do you do now, and so on, and where do you belong, and so on. So yeah, so I'm not sure, you know, so the whole and the solidarity, you know, so I think it's the guilt of the survivor, right? You know, so there's a lot of that as well, you know, so people who have made it, you know, so who survived, you know, so what are their responsibility now towards those who left, and so on. So I don't really have an articulate answer, you know, but it's kind of to add, you know, to the question that Sylvia was posing, you know. Yeah, but that's, yeah, maybe.
Anybody else want to pick up on?
I can try and say something very quickly. That's been the struggle for us for the last 10 years to try and imagine what Sylvia is asking. What does it mean? What is this international of the imagination, and what does it open out without it being reductive, without it being demeaning anybody, without, is it possible formally, content-wise? That's what, for instance, Sumangala and I have leading this insurrections ensemble. That is what it's trying to do at a micro scale, of trying to say, yes, it might be possible, but it has to take the art seriously, the issue seriously, and not to reduce other people's pain as a parochial thing, and try and create a performative world that might approach a potential that was lost. I think for me, 1936 was a moment where all the arts and all the artists, including India's artists, almost cohered against fascism, almost. And then in that same thing, the surrealists try to beat up the social realists and all this kind of nonsense we learn. But that potential in the post-Second World War period was smashed by the Cold War, was smashed by authoritarian forms of nationalism, by the serious definitions of North versus South. And that basically is the challenge. What is the content and the forms that allow for that kind of solidarity? I think that would be, and in theater, it's up to you guys. Thank you.
Mallarika had a question also, no? But before, or anybody wants to also respond before. Mallarika, I guess it will come.
Yeah, first, thank you. It was wonderful listening to all of you. As I was listening to the wonderful presentations, it just came to my mind also while thinking about the movements around the Black Lives Matter and the way it's unfolding in different contexts as well, as against also the All Lives Matter and that sort of a kind of competitive narrative of challenging the thrust of the political edge of that question. And as I was reading around, it just occurred that in terms of the history of slavery and migration and indentured services, there are several competing narratives which are also emerging that, in terms of, say, for example, in the North American context, the Irish migration and the retaliation by saying that, well, the Irish never complained about their history of slavery. So there is a manner in which competitive narratives of migration and migratory experiences are also shaping up the ways our experiences of dealing with migration and the crisis of migration is shaping up. And there are multiple histories. Of course, the South Asian history of slavery and migration are shaped by the historical contingencies. So it's quite an unformed question, but if any one of you would like to reflect on the manners in which culture or the cultural representations of such competitive narratives are played out in the theatrical or in the other spaces.
I guess I started that little bit, so I should be responsible for this. It's a very difficult question what you're asking. I am totally agreeing with you, you know. So there is a competition, there is comparative narratives, and I think the issue for me right now is that there is not enough good and in-depth examination of those things, right? You know, so from academic point of view, but also from, well, you know, so from political point of view, from media, you know, so we are using words, we're using terms, we're using labels, you know, and we don't really give ourselves time to think about them very deeply, you know. So, and unfortunately, it can affect, you know, the outcome, the outcome of how the arts are doing, you know. So, and unfortunately, or fortunately, depends how you look at it, you know. So it can also influence how the funding is distributed, you know, in different places, you know. So that can be supporting either one narrative or another, right? You know, so I think it's very complicated question, you know, that I don't think that has been examined, you know, fully as it should be. So my call for historical, you know, thinking is a call for political thinking, actually, you know. So because yes, you know, so to understand, you know, so where we are today in Europe, you know, so we need to understand, you know, the history of colonization and decolonization and slavery and so on, you know. But at the same time, we also we can't forget what other histories we're building at the same time, maybe, right? At the same time period. You mentioned Irish famine, but I can also talk about Jewish immigration, right? You know, at the beginning of the century and so on. And so I think that what we really have to understand is the complexity and multi-layeredness of those histories, you know, that bring us to the world where we are today, you know. So before we start using labels and so on, you know. So this is to that extent, and I've been working mostly on contemporary work, contemporary sort of theater, you know. So, but like I really think that we need to go back to the jewels, you know, of literature and drama of the past, you know. So in European context, maybe it's Lessing, maybe it's, I don't know, Shakespeare, but also, you know, so the other, you know, sort of histories which I don't know, right? You know, so from India, from so on. In the Russian context, for example, I know more about Russian context, you know, so the history of making theater is the history of borrowings, right? You know, so, and from Europe, but also from Asia, right? You know, so, and I think we forget about it, you know, so yeah, so that would be my brief response. Yeah.
Sumangala, unmute, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure this is really a, you know, a response in that sense to Malarika's question, but you know, it is. I mean, if we actually look at the history either of race and racism, or about of slavery, there are multiple histories, and you know, there's no doubt about it. So it's not just to pose a counter to, say, transatlantic slavery, to say that there was slavery, you know, in South Asia as well, but to say that there were very you know, complex and interconnected histories of migration and travel for several centuries, but you know that there was a very interconnected world, vibrant interconnected world before European domination, and that world also survived to a large extent on slavery, and that slavery was, you know, trading in people from various different kinds of parts of the world. So you know, Africa was a very major source for slaves, but so were other parts of the world. And the distinct break really comes with colonialism. So even with competing narratives, I think one has to keep this history in mind, definitely. So there's no getting past the fact that colonialism and what it did to the world has also shaped the way we think about slavery and its history. So in fact, again, to go back to some work that has been happening, again, in collaboration with ARI, there is, there is a project which uses music as a very major entry point to understand pre-colonial histories of Afro-Asia. And what we are finding is a history of performative forms that actually relate to these very old migrations, which accentuated between the 7th and the 15th centuries. And if one actually looks at the slave routes of those times and the nationalities and so on, it's absolutely mind-boggling. But not just of the roots, but also of the artistic forms that came out of those migrations. So, so like I suppose with COVID, what happened with the sudden sort of iteration of the Black Lives Matter and so on, is that these issues have actually just been thrown up all over again, but it really requires us to be going back also to much older histories, and the art forms that accompanied these older historical movements. I'm not sure that's a response, but yeah.
If I could just add one thing, which is slightly different, so, but it's to the question that Amit posed at the very beginning, the question of pedagogy, and how do you teach those things, right? So I find that the most productive dialogue, that happens about migration is within the interdisciplinary context like this one, right? So I find that as soon as we kind of confined, this dialogue to the theater or performance studies, it gets a little bit repetitive, but as soon as we take it out, to the discussions, with sociologists, with poets, with artists, with political sciences, all the historians, so it becomes extremely enriching, so I don't know if we can advocate, lobby, for the courses, that would be kind of this kind of interdisciplinary nature, so to me, I think this is the way, to approach the subject, so yeah.
So just to add to one of those questions, I was also wondering that because history seems to be a very important thing in terms of historical going back, and contemporary seems to be very charged also. So I had also a general question to all of you, that the moment that it is quite digital, digital ways that these songs are popping up in YouTube, songs are being shared, a lot of kind of peculiar kind of historical thinking is also produced under these conditions of digital sharing, which is being allowed. Sometimes it's almost like right wing, ahistorical kind of things that are being done, but otherwise also very specific, very re-energized to go back and look at certain history. So I had certain questions. One, like Sumangala brought it up, Inyanas and Anamikas also it had come, in a sense that when we look at theater or performance as also a project of research, a project of historical inquiry, sometimes very grounded in that certain kind of political tradition, which is not simply just doing a performance, but looking at surveys, doing you are actually researching on something and then engaging with the problem of representation itself, that it's not perfect, that it's always representation is caught up in a dilemma, or if that song that technically a song or a note is being shared historically, or is it connecting between India and South Africa in the case of Sumangala? So I was just wanting to put it out there that that this problem of history that we have in theatre studies, some debates earlier, say interculturalism, which was sort of slightly coming from a Eurocentric perspective. Nations are finished, so everybody it's a fusion, a melting pot of everything. But what is it that changes now? And this sort of a charged political discussion that we are having, what is it that we are kind of speaking also in terms of terms of actual technical forms and histories of these collapse of, like Peter bringing something of a series which is so contemporary but seems to be so historical in a strange way back to Dürer. So just to
maybe I could sort of just throw in a remark here. I think what is interesting with the historical references we are seeing sort of made and popping up in the discourse about COVID-19 is, when do they start to dispense, for example, a proper discussion? When do they sort of create a self-evidency of certain actions? As I said, this metaphor of fighting an invisible enemy, sort of this immediately implies a logic and dramaturgy that sort of tries to bring the people into trenches. And it also dispenses the idea of solidarity or compassion to a certain extent. And at least for the German cultural scene, I can say sort of it's interesting sort of how much people rather try to create echo chambers for this experience of a pandemic rather than seeking for figures of resilience or resistance. And I think this really is a deep failure of our cultural discourse.
What I was thinking, Amit, when you were asking your question, it's more about also self-education, so I think that what I understand what's been called the Eurocentric sort of vision is this very limited, very small kind of understanding of history and geography that coming from that northern sort of part, so, but as soon as we talk about what Simangala said, so about very deep and different, cultures and different, if I may, globalization movements, that came before, that around that kind of little continent, everything becomes contextualized, and all of a sudden that little frame, that we were using, becomes insufficient and kind of collapses, on its own, so all of a sudden, like I felt that even when I was listening, to this webinar, so I just realized how ignorant I am, in understanding of the geographies, the vast geographies, that migration takes us into, and how we can't, like, sort of stay for a second, in any kind of, gesture or of self complacency in a way, so because I was talking about another word, another kind of cosmopolitan consciousness, so the idea of opening to the world, so and to me, this understanding of taking more histories in, so realizing there is more and more and more layers of things that I don't know, so kind of can humble me in my thinking, so I don't know, that for me, this is all about opening up, reframing my thinking, constantly checking, whether the standpoint I provide, is actually relevant, so, and I stop here.
No, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I'm answering this thing, but I'm saying that, like, as Jana is saying, that really going deep and understanding and listening to the history of our people. For example, something which we haven't mentioned in our discussion when we're talking about immigrants and migration is also, for example, the Bangladeshi migration into Assam, and in which there were thousands of Muslims massacred in the Nalli massacre. And what happens? Why does this happen? When you discuss, even now, when this whole thing of, Bangladeshi migrants, Muslim migrants, if you travel in Odisha, as I have done very, very widely, there is the kind of conflict and tension between, again, the Bangladeshi migrants who are settled on the land and the local Udiyas, each in the name of culture, each in the name of, you know, their own rights, their own identities. What are these histories? What is the cause of this? As you're saying, that to really, really deeply understand, to really go out there, to research, not to take up you know, positions in which you haven't actually learned from our people. I think that people's history, really, really understanding where it is, what it's coming from, what is the pain. So that also a huge amount of, you know, oral history, which I think is also needed. Yes, oral people's history, where you're talking and the political and the personal, and you're talking first person, so you really understand where that person is coming from, what is that loss, what is the actual cultural, political, you know, conflict between these communities. I mean, I still, frankly, I mean, this is a very different question, but it's just that I still can't understand, because when I talk to my Assamese friends, for example, the complete defense that, you know, they've just been, the Bangladeshi Muslims have just been parked on us, our culture is being threatened. But these are Bangladeshi Muslims who've actually come and lived and have actual documents to show that they live there. So I'm saying that, you know, what is this? So nationalism at one side, purity of nationalism, racism, Islamophobia, you know, I'm saying there's such a complex mixture of issues today which are stepping up in our country, which are being therefore, you know, used again, you know, by the right wing, but they're also being used because we have not built up an alternative, you know, people's culture, you know, where people can just, I actually had a dream at some point in which we have a workers center in Old Delhi, where people can actually just come after they've labored, because there is a huge amount of people. There is a huge amount which has gone into drugs, has gone into GB Road as prostitute, but there is a very, very large amount which has resisted despite not having money, which has resisted in spite living in a very humiliating experience, but they have kept their strength up. What are the means to keep that strength up, to keep that dignity up? And then also to develop a resistance to the kind of, you know, right-wing politics, to labor unions also today not being able to you know, to labor rights, which are just today are being, you know, completely washed away. There doesn't seem to be any such thing as, you know, constitutional rights, labor rights, everything seems to be. So I'm saying, I feel, I'm not sure if I'm answering anyone's question, and this is just something I'm thinking of as I'm listening to all of you. You know, I think a very strong movement of, you know, I'm talking as an artist, of art, history, parables, music, labor rights, politics. I'm saying this whole thing almost, you know, like at the time when we had IPTA, it was a different context, but there was a thing in which, you know, the Bengal famine gave rise to, you know, so much of response, people going out there, mixing with people, with the workers, with the peasants, being a part of this movement. It is a whole thing for people like us who are actually involved in culture. You know, think that alternative has to be thought of, created.
Sumangala, you want to respond? I think we are nearing towards the end of conclusion, but so if there is people who want to just respond to the question, or one quick question if there is something to ask.
Amit, Melia wanted to say something.
Oh, yeah, Melia, go ahead.
Okay, sure. Hello, everyone, and thank you for your really inspiring presentations and the conversation. I was struck earlier by Ari's comment about, you know, artists internationally in 1936 coalescing around the issue of anti-fascism, and thinking what, you know, what kind of issues and concerns are common to us today, and the issue of climate breakdown or environmental damage to the planet and you know, the concept of the Anthropocene and all of that came to my mind in relation to migrations. And I was wondering to what extent that features in your work, and you're all doing very different work, but how urgent that issue is in your work, but in particular to the issues of migration, and whether you want to offer some kind of concrete insights in relation to that. And I don't know if we will have time, but I was also really struck by Jana's comments and been thinking about that, about what we can do in our respective institutions around the issues of migration, and you know, how to do our work as academics differently. It connects with Silvia's comments around solidarity, but you know, writing grants, you know, in collaboration with artists and or presenting with them, or creating other kind of academic work. So if any of you have further kind of thoughts about that and modalities of that work, that would be great to kind of just share, or examples of good practice of that.
I think just about the environment part of this, see, when you talk about labor conditions, you inevitably will talk about, you know, conditions of work and environment, which is something that definitely in the film that we did, because there is so much disease, and there is also so much dependence on local medicine, because there are ESR, these are hospitals for workers, but they, by the time you get an appointment, actually we brought this whole theme up in the film. You know, if we've done it through an irony, but the worker actually, you know, has died by the time he's reached the ESR hospital. So a lot of dependence on local forms of medicine. You know, Ayurveda, and there are things like, there are people like M. Sahab. M. Sahab is a sort of a feature in Old Delhi, and he gives you talismans, he gives you all kinds of things. And this is related to what you're saying, because there are serious diseases. A person who's, you know, 16 hours laboring, you know, in an area which is very congested and smoke. I mean, the entire team, all of us, you know, we all got respiratory infection. Now here you're living in this. There is absolutely no facility. It is completely polluted. There is tuberculosis, there's arthritis, because a person who's 55 kilos come from the village is picking up loads which are like something like 300 kilos, 200 kilos on you know, on a thela. What is a thela called in English? On a loading thing. Thela? What is a thela in English?
Cart. Like
cart. Loading cart. So I'm saying that so inevitably you cannot talk about you know, migrant labor without talking about environment in that sense. I would, you know, so I connect it completely. I don't think it's a separate issue. And then environment has also become one of the most fancy things, you know, in the sense it becomes like a thing on its own, that, you know, but it's all connected. It's all connected to the way people are living, to their historical context. So to that extent, all the time we have talked about the breakdown of the medical system. We've talked about congestion, very, very, very trying conditions in which, you know, very heavy weights have to be picked up by people who are, their conditions are not that. We met so many people bleeding from the fingers, and they just, the sheer conditions are deplorable, you know. And because labor is cheap, it can, you know, be replaced very easily too. So that's a big plus point for those who are owning the factory workers. So, you know, the whole thing, definitely you can't, one is not, can't be replaced by the other. It goes together.
If I may, you know, very quickly can talk a little bit about this institutional issue that Emilia asked about, you know. So, well, Canadian funding system for arts is quite atrocious, you know. So, because there is no government-sponsored system, it's all based on grants. Maybe I I don't know, maybe like in India and stuff, you know. So basically when COVID started, you know, so the majority of artists lost their jobs, lost their gigs, lost their funding. So I have a very close friend, you know, who is running a theater company in Toronto, and he said that in 2 weeks, you know, 6 families of his company members, you know, were out of salary, and they simply did not have money to feed their families, you know. And we're talking, well, so there was a call in the academia immediately, you know, for people who are holding grants, you know, so for academic research, you know, for research creation specifically, to invite artists, you know, into their grants, you know, so not to kind of share and well, they would be administering and so on, you know, but then they would be basically giving money back to the community, you know, so if that's possible, you know. So I think it's just you know, kind of a more creative thinking around grant system, you know, for institutions, you know, and for academics. But of course, you know, it has to do with more, again, privileged countries, you know, when those grants exist, you know. But for years, I know that certain academics in Canada, they would just basically, you know, sort of partner, you know, with theater companies, with particular artists, and they would do the work, you know. So I'm actually thinking very specifically about Rick Knowles, who worked a lot with Indigenous artists, and he put together, you know, projects and so on, and then publications. In our work, you know, when we were doing conferences, you know, so we would always put a special budget, you know, for artists, you know, to pay them, to bring their work, you know, so to pay honorariums, you know. So but it only possible, you know, when there is already some kind of system of granting, you know, so that exists, you know, at the particular level, you know, of whatever, you know, institutions. So of course I don't know, I'm not sure how it is in India, for example, you know, but yeah, so that would be my response. Mm-hmm.
Okay, anybody? Otherwise, because we are getting late here, it's going to be 10:30 here in India. Then we will, like, a lot of discussions, a lot of points for discussions. And thank you, all of you, for coming and giving us such engaging interventions and lots more to think at this time.
Thank you very much. Thank all of you.
Thank you very much for asking us.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.